There it is. Awesome. First hurdle we've overcome, right? All righty. There's a little bit of reverb and echo in there. Can you dial that down, or do we need to call someone in? It's all right if not. Okay. I think you all know which workshop you're in. You probably read a little bit about me, so I'm not going to introduce myself or what I've done. We're going to go straight in. We have 60 minutes or a little bit less, and there's a lot to cover. So, first thing that I would like to do is know a little bit about you guys. Who here is a composer, songwriter? Okay, great. Who in here is an audio engineer? Very good. Awesome. Who is a mastering engineer? It's okay if you don't know what that is. We'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, I just wanted to know. Who has contributed, the composers and songwriters, who has contributed music to a media production, either film, short film, audio? Awesome, awesome. That's great, guys. So what we're going to talk about today is what it takes to produce music for film and media. We're titling this Counting the Bits. Any idea why we would call that Counting the Bits? There you go. Absolutely right. It's a digital media. Today it is, at least, in this day and age. We used to do this a little different with actual tape and analog, sort of in an analog fashion. And today we do this with bits, data, ones and zeros, basically. And so when we're talking about producing music for film and media, we need to be very conscientious of that medium. Digital media comes with its own challenges, just like analog audio used to come with its own challenges. In analog audio, we had to be careful not to distort a signal because we put too much dynamics into whatever we recorded. And I think we all know what that sounds like. All that. In the digital world, we have to be also very careful because there's only so much material that we have to work with. And so when we're talking about counting the bits in producing music for film and media, there are a lot of things that we have to take care of, and they are in a world of their own, really. Producing music for film and media means that we have certain things that we need to consider. What is producing music? Well, let's talk about what it is not. It is not composing and writing. You can do this with paper and pencil in the most fundamental fashion. You can record that today with your phone, anything that you can think of, melodic development, something that just pops in your mind, you record that. But that is not producing. Sketching, arranging, orchestrating, except MIDI orchestration. We'll talk about that a little later on, what that exactly means. And as such, it is what producing is not is any process of creating notes or musical textures not considered a production quality audio results. So what does that mean? When we are composing and writing, we're really in the middle of this creative aspect. We're putting something together that is truly artistic, that is truly meaningful in the sense that we're coming up with some concept. We're creating something. Yes, we can document it, but that's not producing. Producing is the second aspect. So we have the writing, we have the composing, and now we need to look at what we do in producing that music with which we've filled paper upon paper and composed that music. So let's talk about what producing is. Producing music for film or media is using sheet music or other resources such as MIDI files and creating production quality audio files. This includes preparing assets for life or virtual instrument recording. That includes MIDI orchestration. Remember, we excluded that earlier from this is not producing. This is producing MIDI orchestration. And I'll explain a little more what that means too. Selecting virtual instruments, recording live orchestra and other instruments, recording high quality virtual instruments, recording other audio such as texture, sound elements. There's a further distinction. There's sound design and then there's producing the music, right? They're a little bit different. Sometimes they blend when we're listening to film music and it's more of an atmospheric underscore. It is very, very easy to just dial up a computer program, push a button, and let the computer produce that. That a lot of times is sound design. It's still sort of composing, but there's a little nuance there. And I think you understand that. Then we finally also have included in producing film music, in this sense, is mixing and mastering audio for use in film and media productions. So, what does that process look like? It's a little blurry. I'm not sure if we can make this a little sharper. Maybe we can. I don't know, somebody there who can turn the lens a little bit. If not, then I think we can still see it. So here's the process. At the start, again, not producing. This is the entire process, from conceiving some notes, some music that we're creating, and then we're going through all that to finally finish with an audio file. What we already excluded is the writing and the composing, right? So this is not, just strike that off this list, but it's part of this whole process from start to finish. Then we get to arranging and orchestrating. And that is where we make that distinction. MIDI orchestration, for example, is part of the producing of that music. We do this either in a digital audio workstation, DAW, or a notation application, or pen and paper. Again, not producing. But where it applies to MIDI orchestration, that's where we go into this arranging, orchestrating with MIDI orchestration. I know I'm making this very complex. It's very, very simple in a sense. Then we go to the recording aspects. Recording today happens primarily in two ways. If you are a composer and you have your own studio set up, you are the recording engineer. Because most often you are asked, especially on lower budget productions, to deliver a final stereo mix of your audio. So you, at that point, are also the mixing engineer. That is why this is important, this process to consider. And if you are breaking into the field or are already involved in that, well, for those, you already know what that process looks like, right? But for the ones who are not used to this yet, if you want to be a film composer and hope to deliver audio material to the production company, you have to be familiar with the process of producing music. It's recording what you created through either virtual instrument or with a live orchestra, which is very exciting and a huge field that we're not going to talk about because that comes with its own set of rules and processes and procedures. But at a minimum, you're going to work with virtual instruments or with live musicians. Even on smaller budget productions, you have the choice of saying, hey, if this is a small ensemble, for example, that you created a piece for, you can go into the studio, bring in some musicians, and record that. That's producing that music that you just wrote. From there, once the music is recorded, then we're going to mix it. Mixing, again, today happens for most part in a digital audio workstation, meaning whatever you use, a PC or a Mac, you can even mix on a mobile device, an iPad. I've done it. Lots of successful composers and mixing engineers have done that too. Or you're mixing in a studio. If the budget allows and you're going to a mixing stage in LA, for example, All you need to do is you take your audio files, you go there, and they'll set it all up. They have a huge console there. Most of the time, that's a digital console as well that is connected to some sort of a computer system. So we're still working within that digital medium. Once the music has been mixed, at that point, we're splitting this up a little bit. We're mixing for the film, in a sense, if it is a film score that needs to be mixed, or we're mixing for an album, a soundtrack that gets released later on. They're two separate processes. You'll see that. We'll talk a little more about that. There's a mastering process. And so from this point on, mastering, we're moving into the world away from film, really. Because at that point, mastering typically happens. And again, this is typical. Mastering typically happens for music that gets produced as a soundtrack, or it is being played out in some sort of a single audio file, either on YouTube or some other medium. That's where we master. From there, we deliver. So we're bringing things back together. We're delivering to whoever needs to receive that file. It's either a production company that does final mixing at a soundstage for the theater, or you're delivering files up into the either sphere called Apple or whatever. So when we're producing that music, when we're working on as a composer, you've just created this fantastic music. You have, in other sense, composed. You've written the music, either on paper or in some fashion in a notation application. What do we do from that point on? Okay, we're going to have to think about, well, essentially we're going to record this music. We're going to produce it, we're going to mix it, we're mastering it. As an effective composer, you have to work in this day and age extremely fast. And what will help you the most at that point is setting up a template. Template meaning that you have certain assets that, or certain aspects of this mixing and recording process worked out. That includes setting up favorite go-to libraries to produce the music. So what are libraries? Libraries, we typically call them when we're dealing with virtual instruments. Who here has worked with virtual instruments? Okay, most of you have. All right, this can start in GarageBand, for example, if you're using the Mac, right? That has a library in it. A library of virtual instruments. Somebody has gone through the work of going in the studio, bringing in a bunch of musicians, and then recording bits and pieces, articulations, that you can now, when you're pressing a note on the keyboard, play back. When we're setting up our templates, we select a range of libraries of these virtual instruments. It doesn't matter what it is, orchestral library, solo instrument library, whatever it is. You need to put the work into picking the ones that you want to work with. And you do this in a fashion where you become familiar with that instrument, because every library, virtual instrument library, will give you a host of articulations. Think about an orchestral library, or think about an orchestra. Anybody know how many sections are in an orchestra? I won't go there. Lots of different instruments, right? When you're going to listen to a concert or watch a concert, you see all these musicians there. You have these different sections in there. You got the percussion, you got the brass, you got the woodwinds, you got the strings, and then there are divisions in between. And when you're listening to a piece of classical music, whatever, you hear them play and it all sounds great, but you know what happens on the smallest level? They're not just playing the notes on a piece of paper. What they're really playing is articulations. Whether it's a string run or a flute run, whatever it is, we call it an articulation. And that articulation is capsulated or captured in a virtual instrument library. So when you take the string section, for example, and you want to play back a legato line that connects note by note by note, and then all of a sudden you're switching over to a staccato note or several staccato notes, we all understand what those are, right? Legato, staccato, we don't need to talk about that. All right. What we're really doing is we're playing back two different recordings of that real instrument. Do you understand that concept? So when we're picking our favorite go-to libraries, not only do we need to become familiar with what they sound like, but we need to become familiar with the articulations. I'm often asked, well, how many instruments are you playing? How many, what instruments are you playing? And sort of tongue-in-cheek, a lot of times my answer is all of them. Why is that? It's because we need to become familiar with producing that music that we've just written. Think about that line again. You wrote a legato line that now switches over to staccato for the next few measures. Well, if you don't know what that instrument fundamentally sounds like, you're not going to pay attention to that. You're going to use that same legato articulation from that virtual instrument, even when there are staccato notes that should be played back. Well, the final result is not going to sound very realistic, right? So we're looking for realism, and that means that you have to become familiar with the library that you're choosing. Make sense? All right. So the goal here is to take our MIDI tracks that we capture in our digital audio workstation and produce realistic audio from them. Start with what you have and then improve from there. If we mentioned GarageBand, if that's all you have, great. Become familiar with the articulations that you have access to, the instruments that you have access to in GarageBand in this case. One caution, because what we're really after is realism, and especially when you're tasked with having to deliver a final result to a production. Don't rely on sound sets that are coming from notation applications. Why? Yes. Right. So the answer was because the MIDI is talking to Pro Tools, right? How it's expressed. That's right. Great answer. I'll give you another one. Sound sets in notation software is really just there to give some sort of an expression of what this could sound like. It's an approximate reproduction of what that articulation is that you're going to be after. But think about that legato line. When you're putting notes into the notation software and it is some sort of a string run, and you're playing this back, you will be able to tell that this is coming from a piece of software that is not designed to produce production quality results, right? I think we've all heard that, what that sounds like. So what we need to do is we need to stay away from sound sets as the final delivery medium. That's not going to give you the quality that you need to produce. Again, remember, we're talking about producing high quality music for a final production result. The next one is know your instruments. All virtual instrument libraries have weaknesses because they're at best a reproduction of a real musician in the studio being recorded based on what the director of that production is asking them to play. By the time that it is being reproduced in a computer sense, they all have great things about them and they all have weak things about them. So how does that play out in real life? We talked about that legato run, a strings run, for example. It's very, very difficult to reproduce that with MIDI notes, where that MIDI note triggers a recorded sample of a note. Once you start hearing what that should sound like in a real orchestra, and you compare that with that reproduction of that legato run from a virtual instrument library where that legato recording is not particularly has been recorded with that legato run itself, you'll be able to tell. So what do you do if you have a virtual instrument library that just doesn't have great pre-recorded legato runs that play back exactly the notes that you need to have in your production? What do? Find another one. Yes. Or you rewrite your music. You rearrange your music. In other words, you stay away from the weaknesses. Again, the end result is high quality production end results. We talked about getting to know your virtual instrument libraries. Know what the instrument sounds like. If you've never been to a classical concert, go grab one. Listen to classical music. If you intend to work with an orchestra, you need to become intimately familiar with what these instruments sound like, almost by themselves, so that you can make a judgment on whether to use a particular articulation from a virtual instrument library or not. In other words, you need to become a master of that instrument, whether you play it in real life or not. Of course, it helps. We have a cello player here, which is one of my favorite instruments, and I'm sure you know what that instrument is supposed to sound like, right? So when you're going to a cello virtual instrument library and you're playing back an articulation, you kind of go, I'm not so sure about that one. So vitally important. The other one is, and I know this is a lot to take in, is sort of theoretical. We'll get to the practical aspects here in just a moment, but write it down. This one will be available online as a download. I'll give you that later, and then you can just grab it from there. Know your articulations. The other big key is, and I hear this quite often, work with, this is a little tip, work with controllers. What are controllers? CC, continuous control controllers. It's coming out in the MIDI world. There are different controllers that we work with, expression, volume, I have them listed here, modulation, and also some samples in virtual instrument libraries are triggered based on velocity. So if you're pressing the key just slightly, there might be a particular articulation that's being played back, and the harder you hit that key, that sample player will pick a different articulation. So you need to become familiar with those. You need to work with those. There are techniques. The reason why I'm not going further into this here is because we have another workshop tomorrow afternoon where I'm talking a little bit more about the process of actually composing and writing and doing all these things. But B, just go on YouTube. There are dozens and dozens of really great tutorials out there on how to use your continuous controllers. Just find them there. Then the other one is a little tip as well, as far as producing and as part of the producing templates. Make sure that you understand and can work with the sample players. That's the software that is playing back that virtual instrument articulation. Become familiar with it. There are several out there. There's Contact. A lot of virtual instrument library manufacturers now have come out with their own. You need to become a master of that piece of software. All right, so what does that actually look like when we have a template set up? I'm already jumping ahead. This is, what can you pack into a workshop here that I can convey to you? All I can do at this point is show you examples. To get to this is part of a production. Sorry, it's a little blurry there. What you see there is a small section of a project called The Thorn. Has anyone seen it in the theaters or been to? Yep, it was just released as a movie into theaters this last week. A stage production, it's basically sort of like a Cirque du Soleil meets the Passion Play. Fantastic. If you have an opportunity to watch it online, I think they're going to release it as streaming before Easter here. Just go to thorn.net, I believe it is, and it's amazing. So this is a snapshot from the music that was created for The Thorn, for the stage play, and then later on used in the movie. This is a section of a project, a template that has 1,400 MIDI tracks in them. And each and every one of that MIDI track is connected in real time, in real life, to a virtual instrument. So if I'm selecting one of these tracks and I set it to recording, when I play back on the keyboard, that immediately plays back. In other words, I'm not sitting here and saying, okay, well, let's load up the player and let's load up my articulation, and that kills the producing process. So that's all set up. And these 1,400 instrument tracks here in this digital audio workstation connect to, this is a very elaborate setup. So obviously not something that you start with right up front, but that's connected to 3 high-powered computer workstations that have these 1,400 instruments spread across, so that when I am having to produce that music, I can just start the playback button and it plays back whatever articulation. So each of these objects represent a piece of MIDI information that is now going out to those virtual instruments, producing the audio. The audio comes back into this computer, and from there I can now record it or do whatever else I need to do with it. Does that make sense? All right. So this is one of the mixing templates that you might want to set up. Again, you don't have to be this elaborate. Depending on the type of music that you are producing. Remember, we're producing, we're not composing and writing. You're now in the business of creating audio tracks. Might be fairly simple. If you just have 4 instruments, that's great, it's 4 tracks, or maybe a little bit more depending on whether you're splitting up the articulations or not, right? So your template may look entirely different than what this looks like here, but you have to set up a template, because the idea here is that you have to work fast and you have to be familiar with what you set up, so that at any moment in time when creativity strikes and you're done with basically documenting whatever it is that music is supposed to do, you can now immediately move on and say, okay, here's my template, here's all the setup, and now I can produce and record that music. Does that make sense? All right. The next one that we're going to talk about is, oh, actually, let me show you this real quick. I hope I can make that happen. I'm going to stop this here for a second. Let me see if I can do this. This is that template that we were talking about. Still keeps going. Still keeps going. We have all kinds of things in here. We have percussion in there. Then we have, it's a little blurry. This is woodwinds. They're color coded, so I can quickly go to that. That's the brass, still going. Everything green is strings, still going. What you see there are different libraries. Remember what we talked about. Find the best library for whatever articulation you want. No, none of the libraries that are currently available out there, virtual instrument libraries, do everything well. Remember how we talked about? Know your weaknesses. That's why you have different ones in here. You have Vienna instruments, you got LA scoring strings, you have Symphobia in there, you have Spitfire audio. This is still strings. And then we finally, I think, I can't read it. That's the percussion coming up. Is this needed every time? No, absolutely not. What we're talking about here is a setup that has been groomed and configured over a number of years. Every time that I'm adding another virtual instrument library, I have to go in and change this template. I have other templates that are for modern productions. This is a full orchestral template. When I know that I have to contribute orchestral music to a production, that's the template that I'm going to use. Later on, we're not going to bore you with more of this down here. There's setups of synthesizers, Omnisphere, whatever is producing that atmospheric music, pads or things like that. They're also part of this template. Yes, sir.
Is it okay to ask questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I assume you're using like something like Ensemble Pro or something.
Yep.
Stuff out there. So you don't use like one sound library and then like 16 MIDI channels and like east west or something. Channel 1 is the violin.
Mm-hmm.
Channel 2 is violin 2. You have an instance of every instrument for every articulation.
Yes. So the correct. So the question was, we have a MIDI track set up for every articulation that we might need to be producing from a virtual instrument library.
Do you ever do like key switching, like where
Yes.
instead of like you have a run like
Yep. Yes, absolutely.
on one track, not
Correct. So the question is, are we using key switching to change articulations on a single track? Yes, we do. If the library, the virtual instrument supports that, yes, we most definitely do. This is part of conserving sort of the track count, because at some point you're going to run into resource issues as well. However, what I've done in the past on systems that are smaller, I duplicate that track, going to another virtual instrument instance of that same instrument, so that I can now switch quicker between articulations, because sometimes it becomes a challenge. So when you're using, and you understand what we're talking about, key switch, right? So for example, a keyboard layout, let's say that you have 88 keys on your MIDI keyboard. What some instruments do is the bottom section on that keyboard is dedicated to switching articulations based on which key you're pressing. So if you're pressing an F, for example, an F1 down there, or F0, wherever that lays, okay, that now plays back a legato articulation when you're playing up here. Now you go to F sharp, that is now playing back, whatever I'm playing up here is now playing back the staccato articulation. And so this way you can switch back and forth very quickly. What is very difficult a lot of times is when there is a transition that needs to take place between that legato and the staccato, then you might need another track that you can do this with to lay over that, but it's basically saying that the same virtual instrument, just on a different MIDI channel. So I overcome that challenge with the key switching issues. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So let's talk about the mixing template. Here is an example of what this could look like. And primarily what I wanted to demonstrate here is at the bottom, you know what a mixing console looks like, right? So we don't need to talk about that. At the top, this is Cubase, by the way. at the top, every little blue section, little blue rectangle there represents an effect that we might drop in there. That could be a reverb, that could be compression, that could be gating, that could be limiting, that could be something else, even creative effects that we might be using to produce that music. So let me give you an example. So when we have a percussion track that is playing back, and that percussion track is just overpowering everything else that's happening, right? You have long decays of the samples. So when you hit, for example, the bass drum, you know, boom, and that thing just keeps going on and on and on and on. Well, that really has an impact because summing everything together with other instruments, all of a sudden that drum sound will overpower everything else that's happening there. So how do we do that? Well, we could make sure that that sample is cut off, you know, but that's not a really good solution either. So what we do is creatively we might use a compressor. A compressor is you understand how a compressor works a little bit, kind of, sort of. YouTube is your friend. So a compressor allows us to even that out so that that does not all of a sudden become overpowering. We're looking for a consistent mix that fits well within the final results that you're trying to produce. It's a skill that needs to be acquired. Again, it starts with you knowing your articulations of what they do, but then there might still be some treatment that might be required. For example, I don't think we have the time to really go deep into that. I'm just going to touch on that a little bit as a practical example. When you have a percussion track where a bass drum is doing something, you know, and then you have the basses and the strings, they can produce amazingly deep sounds, frequency-wise, right? So now the bass drum and the bass strings, they live sort of in that same frequency EQ range, right? And they interact with each other and everything becomes real muddy all of a sudden. Then on top of that, you're layering in a synth bass. That makes it even worse. So now you're going to have to do something with that. You're going to have to say, okay, we're going to either EQ treat that so that we're creating room in that mix. And that's what we're doing with these effects up there. To some degree, we use EQ. We have EQ plugins. If you don't want to use the built-in EQs in your digital audio workstation and you're going to whatever you want to choose from the hundreds of EQ plugins, you drop them in right there. Again, so we have the producing template that lines up all the virtual instruments that we have. Then we also are working in that same template on mixing, but we call this something different. It's the mixing template that you're working on, even though it's the same file. Does that make sense? Sort of? This is for the individual MIDI tracks. Summing them together into groups. So all the strings together in one group. All the woodwinds together in one group, electric guitar, whatever it is, in another group, and then from there, we go to this. This is Pro Tools. The other one was Cubase. What I wanted to point out is, and again, I apologize for not being able to demonstrate that better, in better quality. On the side, what you're seeing there is a fairly elaborate mixing template that we're setting up. And what we do is, especially for producing audio in the film world, depending on how elaborate that production is, you might be asked to deliver your music in what we call stems. Are you familiar with that term? Okay. So, and this is really dependent on the mixing engineer. So you will have to work with a mixing engineer and ask them, okay, how many stems do you want me to deliver to you? He might tell you, well, 8, 10, 12, could be less, could be more. It all depends on how much room they have in their final mixing platform that they're using. I've had productions where they asked me to deliver only 6 stems. Then you have to get creative. right? Because these 6 stems have to include orchestral instruments, your synthesizers, percussion, solo instruments by themselves, and on top of that, ideally, you do not bake in the reverb or delay, in other words, the effects for these stems into the stems themselves. Does it make sense what I'm saying? Kind of? All right. Then there are the productions. They say, well, we got room. And then you split it all up. But what you do essentially is, and this is what you see there in orange up there, I think. Yes. You have different mixes set up in your template so that all the strings go out through mix A. All the woodwinds go out through mix B. All the brass goes out through mix A. And then you can do something else with that. You can add different reverb to the strings because they may require different reverb. If everything sounds too muddy and too far back in the room, then you dial it down for certain stems, for certain instrument sections. Stay away from using a lot of hall and reverb on percussion instruments unless it's done for a specific effect, right? Because they just get washed out. And once that reverb is in there and you have too much in there, it's very difficult to take it out later on. All right, well, we have a few minutes left. Let's have some fun. Let's look at an actual I need to shut something down here real quick. Give me a second. Okay. This is Cubase. And what you're seeing here is a pre-production sketch for the movie Beyond the Mask. You're familiar with it? Beyond the Mask? Okay. Pardon? Well, thank you. So before we went into actual scoring, I think this is actually the very first piece that I delivered to the Burns family when they were still making a decision who to use for scoring that film. So we did talk a little bit about what we wanted to do, what the musical signature of the film should be like, what the film should sound like from a music perspective. And after we initially talked and I read the story, I read the script, this is what I sort of envisioned what this could be, right? And as you're listening to that, you'll probably pick up a few things of the actual music, if you're familiar with it, that ended up sort of quality-wise and signature-wise in the film. But this is an actual production, a quick production template that I used in Pro Tools. So let's see if it plays back. All right. So what's happening here? We're already using combined instrument sections. That's primarily because I needed to work fast. I needed to get to them quickly. And that's why you're seeing, for example, things such as brass low, brass high. Can you read that over there? Okay, is it sharp enough now? Woodwinds high. If we're scrolling back, Where are the woods? Brass low, the woods were earlier, I think. Here we go, brass high, woods high, and if I'm soloing that, and I go right here, that's not brass that you're hearing there, the lower notes. Can someone spot the instrument? Clarinet, that's right, it's a bass clarinet actually, which if you're familiar with, now we're getting into orchestrating, if you're familiar with a wood orchestra, woodwinds orchestra, you can actually emulate what the brass section does with woodwinds very well. And a lot of times what we do that's a technique that we're using in orchestrating music, orchestral music. So that's why that shows up here, but it's not brass, right? And so from there, what we have then is we feed all of these different instruments into what's happening down here. Do you see that? A verb B, A aux, B verb A, B verb B, B aux, and so on. Why do we do that? Exactly right. So each of these tracks that I have in there, let's go with the woodwinds. I say, okay, the woodwinds, so that I am not creating this big mush. We're not feeding the entire orchestra through a single reverb effect. We want to split that up because the woodwinds might need to be a little drier than everything else, especially the solo instruments, right? You can't keep them in a big room somewhere in the back. They will never translate well. So we split this up. We're creating these reverb groups that we then take a portion of that audio track and feed through that reverb group to only bring that back later on. And where we bring this back is down here where you see that A, B, C, D, E, F. These are mixed groups. So now we're feeding the original track into that mixed group A, for example, and also bring in our reverb, if I wanted to, into that same mixed group. Remember how we talked about how many stems you need to deliver? Sometimes you need to combine the actual instrument section with the reverb or the effects into a single stem. This gives us that ability. Now, if the final recording engineer says, the re-record engineer says, well, just have fun, then at that point, we create a stem for just the dry, or, well, it's never really dry. Every virtual instrument is going to have some room involved, and sometimes that's causing a problem by itself. But then we say, okay, well, let's assume it's dry for a moment. Here's one track for the dry signal, and here is one or more tracks for the reverb. So that we're giving tools to the re-recording mixer, because now he can say, okay, well, yeah, that doesn't translate well in the Atmos Dolby mix, right? So let's bring down the reverb a little bit. Now he has options, or she has options, right? So again, that's why it's very important to ask and work with the re-recording mixer, the person who does the final mix, how many stems they want. Now, of course, this is very simple and easy to do when you are asked to deliver a stereo final mix. Then it's clear, then you make that decision. Then we finally get into the mix stems. These are the ones where we're in one pass can record that entire mix into separate audio files. Do you understand now the concept of this template? This is designed to work fast. Because when the clock is ticking, you're going to have to produce. You're going to have to produce fast. So set up a template, put the time into creating a template similar to this, so that you can just drop the audio files in, the original audio files that you're exporting out of your digital audio workstation, where you're doing the pre-producing of the mix with, so that you can then just press the record button. Obviously, you're mixing it here as well, right? But the final medium is the stems. Okay, I talked enough. We could dig a little deeper into that and have some fun with playing around with effects, but I want to make sure that we have enough questions, time for questions. Yes, sir.
Who does when you're setting, when you're building files and you're actually producing something, where's the process of where it goes into the Atlas format or however it's going to be? Is that the re-recorder's job?
Yes, you will not touch that at all. That's never, in my experience and from other composers that I've seen do this, they don't run into that. Yeah, okay, so the question was, what happens when a film needs to be mixed in Atmos? Do we take care of that, or is that the re-recording engineer who's doing that, the final mixing stage? And the answer to that is the final mixing stage. So, no, we do deliver a lot of times, unless there are solo instruments or solo tracks that can be delivered in mono. For most part, we do deliver stereo stems. Yeah.
So do you typically do all your MIDI stuff in Cubase and then all your audio stuff in Pro Tools, and you send a Pro Tools project to?
Yes. So the question was, do I pre-produce the music in a digital audio workstation like Cubase, and then do the mixing of the stems and the delivery of the audio files in Pro Tools? Yes, to both parts of that question. The reason why we do that is because historically, Pro Tools comes out of the pro recording world. While Pro Tools has the ability to work with MIDI tracks, and some people really are adamant about that, no, I'm going to do everything, MIDI and audio and Pro Tools, and that's totally fine. Doesn't work for my brain. Cubase in this case, and there are other applications like Logic or whatever you want to use, they're typically more geared toward the MIDI world, which means I have a whole lot more control over the MIDI notes. I can drop them in faster. I can do all kinds of things. There's a recording mode that if creativity strikes, sometimes I'm doing composing in Cubase, composing the actual writing in Cubase, right? Because I have my template already set up. So if I'm going, okay, well, this would probably be good to be played by an oboe, whatever. So I go to the oboe track and then just play around with it. What Cubase does is, even when Cubase doesn't run, and I'm just playing around, doodling around, and all of a sudden I'm going, ooh, I really like that line, I can push a key shortcut that then now captures whatever I just played back as the MIDI track, MIDI information in there. It's called retrospective recording. I think Pro Tools has finally introduced that in the latest version. I have to look at that. But yeah, so this is one of the reasons why I do this typically in Cubase. Yes, sir.
So, I'm actually the orchestra director here.
Awesome.
So, yeah, it's a lot of fun. But I hopped into a lot of this last year.
Okay.
I've never used Pro Tools, nothing. I usually write everything Finale. And I was kind of playing around with it, dropped the MIDI from Finale into Pro Tools.
Mm-hmm.
And of course it didn't sound as
Yes.
great as I thought it was, because I use Abbey Road 1 and BBC 4.
Okay.
And I'm playing around with those, but then, of course the articulations are how I done it way back
Mm-hmm.
earlier. But trying to figure out how to make that sound more realistic, which I know you said not to drop the MIDI, like drop that, use those things from Finale or Sibelius and put those into Pro Tools.
Yes.
So is there an easier process to basically go from Finale to that, or is it just more like you have to write everything?
The question is there an easier process to go from a notation software just like Sibelius or Finale to Pro Tools? The short answer to that is no. Comes back to what we were talking about earlier. If this is destined to be used as a final product in a higher quality production, don't do it. For two reasons. Number one, you could probably individually export track by track out of Finale, out of the notation software. The audio track, of course, it lets you do that. Some notation software is now sophisticated enough, like Dorico, Steinberg's Dorico. I would highly recommend it. That that you can actually produce fairly good quality individual tracks fairly quickly, and then bring them into Pro Tools. And by the way, part B of my question, why Pro Tools and not something else? It's not that you can use Pro Tools for final delivery, but most professional post-production houses will use Pro Tools, and they will ask you to deliver a Pro Tools session with all the audio files attached. They want the whole session, right? So yes, you could produce the individual audio tracks and then drop them into Pro Tools and then mix from there. That's always there for you. But the reason why you probably weren't all that happy with the final results is because of the shortcomings that a sound set out of a notation software is it's just not there. So what happens a lot of times is, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow, you'll actually hear that if you plan on coming back. So how do you go from the notation to a final product? You will have to go through that process of using something like Cubase that is connecting to high quality virtual instruments, and basically just drop the MIDI notes in there, and then starts the producing part of that we talked about today, where you sometimes have to sit down note by note and work on the articulation that you're choosing for that, or you're working with that virtual instrument, which is not the sound set from your notation software, to use CC expression or modulation, to coax a realistic production and result out of that. That's the tough part. You have to learn to do that, otherwise it's never going to sound anything close to what it is. On that note, just to give you an example for comparison, if you listen to the soundtrack of Beyond the Mask, 96% of that music was entirely produced with that template that you saw there in the computer. We used some solo instruments. I think we had a cello that we used for one of the tracks, and then there's the classical piece in there. I forgot the name now. That was recorded with a small ensemble, but everything else was totally mixed and produced inside between Cubase and Pro Tools. But that took work. I was working on that for 6 months, solid. Yes, sir.
So did you have to make a decision that you'd rather have an ensemble play this than a regular cello because you were having a hard time finding that, or was it like you're just sitting there and it's like, I want a real cello?
Yeah. So the question is, was that how difficult of a decision was that to use a real cello or not to use a real cello or do everything else? Budgetary constraints. To record with a live orchestra is extremely expensive. That simply was not in the budget, and right from the get-go. Also, right from the get-go, we made a decision to make the sound, the language, the musical language of that film, what that film sounded like from the music's perspective, extremely large. Several concepts played into that. The story plays between Europe and America, so there's this like continent spanning aspect of it, right? And it needed to be large, it needed to be huge. This is where budgetary constraints come even more into play, because we simply couldn't do that. We couldn't bring in an 80 or 90 piece orchestra and then double that in order to get to the same sound that a virtual instrument library that had just come out at that time by a company called HDO. That was the largest sampled orchestra ever produced. And the way they went about that is brought in, I can't remember, 60 string players that were just for the strings. And then they brought in 40 brass. I can't remember how, so that produced a sound, sorry about that, that produced a sound that was just simply not possible to do with a live orchestra even, or cost prohibitive. All right. Any other questions? We may have one more. All right.
This is a great question. film and I know we're gonna run out of money,
Mm-hmm.
you have to start dialing back stuff that you did, or like what is the thought process there?
The question is, if the production is running out of money, how does that impact, I'm paraphrasing what you're saying, how does that impact my decisions? It runs out of money, you keep going. Um, yeah, so let's talk about something that's very realistic here, especially in our group. Budgets typically are not that great, right? If someone has made a decision to use original music for production, then the budget is probably not what it should be. So going into that, you know right from the beginning what you're up against. And right at the beginning, you make decisions based on that. So example, Beyond the Mask, we knew this needed to be a virtual instrument score. So now the effort and the work went into making it sound as realistic as possible. But budget being what it is, as a creative, sometimes you're being asked to work at rates that you shouldn't be working at. In comes integrity too. You know, keep this in mind. This is a ministry unto the Lord. At the end of the day, if you desire to become a professional, it's like what Stephen said earlier, right? You still have to consider the fact that you're doing this unto the Lord. Free is not free. Somebody has paid the price, right? What we call free in our realm, the most expensive price that anyone has ever paid is Jesus on the cross, right? That's why that is free for us today. And I'm not advocating that you should work for free. What I'm saying is there comes a point where you're going to have to throw integrity into the mix and say, okay, yep, I know my hourly rate now goes down, but I'm just going to finish it. All right. Well, guys, I really enjoyed this. Appreciate you coming out and listening to me talk.